All right, so we got our lens distortion figured out and we're removing it from our images. And we have our field of view figured out from the combination of our lens and the active image area of our camera. So we can now confidently move forward with setting up our tile world, knowing that our field of view is accurate and that the lens distortion from the lens will not stymie our ability to line our images up. So let's get started. To start building the panorama, we're going to use the card node. Not card 3D, but card. Cards are born with UV coordinates. So when we connect the image input here to the card, and I'm going to view the card by hitting 1, it'll jump straight into the 3D mode. Frame it. You'll see that the image maps right onto the card. So everything works right out of the box. It knows what to do when you attach an image to a primitive like this. You'll notice that the card has lens and aperture fields in it. So it knows a little bit about tile worlds and about view frustums. We can copy this information from the camera over into the card, and then the card will actually know about this view frustum from the camera. I like to expression link them, so in case I need to edit it, I can edit them all from the camera rather than editing each card individually. So to do that, I'm going to take the focal length and hold down Control while I drag that knob to the focal length field. Same for the horizontal aperture here. Hold down Control and drag it. Now this expression linked to my camera prototype, and this card could be edited by editing these things in the camera. To move the card out along the frustum of this view that it now knows a little bit about, we can use the Z control here to bump it out. And you'll notice it snaps right into the frustum of the camera when I do that. Let's move it out to 100 there. It's pretty good sanity check to see that everything is working right, that you've got the information entered correctly, that it fits inside the frustum of the camera. Now the card needs to be rotated along the Z, so I'll rotate it here to create the correct orientation. And then for the next card, I'll simply duplicate this card and attach it here. So now both cards are visible in the viewport. And you'll see the way that it's turning white here. This is a good sign that they don't have alpha channels. So let me go into the images themselves and I will turn on auto alpha for all these images so that they get a solid alpha right at the read node. There we go. Now to get this card into the correct place, if I look at the image here, it looks like this other tile is over to the right of this one. So I will start rotating this card around to the right. Let me make sure that I have the right card selected, card 2, and I will start rotating it along the Y until it lines up. I'm kind of cheating here a little bit because I pre-baked these numbers just to save some time, but there we go. I got it lined up. Now you could always manually line it up by middle clicking in here and dragging left and right until it lines up. That's the process of manually doing it. To do the next tile, I'm just going to duplicate the center card again. And let's manually rotate this one into place. I will select its Y first and rotate it about its Y. So if I hold down Shift and middle click in here, it'll speed up the rotation. It goes faster when you hold down Shift. More coarse settings. (9:3), and we'll rotate that right into place. So right now I'm still viewing through the default view let's create a render camera to render from or to view from rather than using the default view. Because in Nuke, you need to have an actual camera. You can't render from the perspective or default view. So I'm going to start by using my camera that we created as the prototype, and I'll just call this one cam main. And we might as well, we can leave everything the same, but I'm going to make it a little less wide angle. I'm going to go a little bit more telephoto on this camera. Say I'll move it to 24, because that'll zoom in a little bit more to our shot, and we'll view through this camera. There we go. Now if I want to edit the view, edit the camera while looking through it, I have to hold down Control and click this button so that it turns green. So now we're viewing through that camera, and I'm holding down Alt and right mouse button to pan around my image. So let's create some keyframes here. I'm going to start on frame 1. And it looks like these last shots were never level. So let's roll the camera just a little bit. So go to Camera here and Z. And I'll roll the camera to level it out. There we go. So let's try rendering this. To render it, I need a scanline render. But first let's collect this into one big scene so it's easier to connect to the scanline render. For that, I'm going to use a scene node. And if I select all of the geometry I want to connect to the scene node, I can do it all in one go by dropping down a scene node. And I'll connect the camera as well, just so that we can view it all here at the same level when the scene node is active. So let's just render this view using this camera. Drop down a scanline render. And I'll connect it to the camera. It needs a camera. And if you want to define the resolution you're rendering at, you can connect your own background here. I'll just use a constant. And we'll set this to 720p. Now if I view at the scanline render node and hit tab in the viewer here to toggle back to 2D, it will render the 3D geometry that I've connected to the scanline render here. Now you'll notice there's still some little problems in my panorama. Where the cards are intersecting, I'm getting these nasty lines. In the scanline render, we can use this Z-blend mode here. And Z-blend mode will take those intersections of geometry and it will blend between them by this distance here. So you can set up a blend distance, and by adjusting this control, it will look in front and behind that intersection, and it will blend those two cards together. So increasing it will increase it. In this case, my cards aren't very well lined up, so let's go ahead and take this opportunity to go touch up the alignment of the cards a little bit more. It looks like the card to the left is a little bit still too far to the left. So we'll go here and we're just going to tap it by 1/10 of a degree increments. So that's even too much. There we go. Perfect. 1/10 of a degree. Bumped it over, and now it's lining up pretty good. So between the Z blend and getting the cards pretty close, you can create a nice smooth result. Let's look over this way and see how our other cards are lining up. And I'll just use the same cam main here. I'm going to hit tab to go back into 3D view. And then I will hold down Alt and right mouse to pan over to find the seam of my other card. I think it was right around here. Let's look at that seam. We'll look through the scanline render again, hit Tab. And that card seems to be lining up. These two cards seem to be lining up pretty nicely. So I'm not going to... there's a slight misregistration there. We'll just nudge this card down ever so slightly, rotate it down. So rotating it along the X, nudging it down by 1/100 of a degree increments. There we go, until it lines up better. It's still not lining up there. And that's, if you look closely, it's because it's obvious that the rotation, it's not rolled quite right. It's rolling one way too much. So let's maybe not that much, 1/2 degree this way. There we go. So now that card's lining up much better. So between the Z blend and getting the card lining up pretty well, we have a fairly seamless result there. And there's no restriction that you use static images for these tiles. They could just as easily be moving images. Okay, so let's render out a test of this. If we're going to create animation, we'll have to also have motion blur. And by default, the scanline render doesn't really render motion blur. You need to turn it on. And you can use either the multi-sample motion blur, which is, it can be kind of slow to render, or you can use vector blur. Let's look at how to do vector blur, since it's faster to render and a little bit more complex to set up. For that, we're going to need a vector blur node. And we're also going to need some animation here. So let's make some animation real quick. I'm going to go back into the 3D view. And we'll make sure that we have our cam main selected. And I'm going to pan over this way. I'm going to make this view a little more wide. It actually kind of bugs me. It's so telephoto. It's a little too telephoto. We'll go a little more wide angle. And I will set a keyframe there. And then we'll go to frame 50. And I will rotate it this way. Set another keyframe. There we go. And now I have animation between these two. So back to the vector blur node. We only really want to vector blur the RGBA channels. And we need to tell it what the vector channels coming in are. What's the channel that defines how much the image is moved? So let's check the scanline render. And we'll go to the shader, and we can see that it's set to do distance type motion vectors, which is the preferred type in Nuke. And the motion vectors are being output to the forward channel. So in our vector blur, we want to pick forward as our UV channels. And for multiply, we'll put this to 0.5 because with the distance motion vectors, it's defining the entire distance the pixel has moved. And if we want a 180 degree shutter, we have to set the multiply to 0.5. So let's render a frame here. Go to 28. And first we'll just render it straight through the scanline render. No motion blur. but now we'll view it at the vector blur node. You can see it's generating a little bit of motion blur. So I'm going to go back to put the scan line on the 1 view. And back to the 2 view. You can see it's not moving a whole lot from frame to frame. Oh, maybe 1 is the correct setting. Actually, doesn't even seem like 1 is correct. We may need to turn it up. What I like to do when I'm unsure if I'm getting the correct motion blur out of the vector blur node is I will go to the scanline render and I will use multisample, which is always correct in 3D, and I will set it to some setting that is high enough to get a good result. So let's put this up to 9. So that's about what our motion blur should look like. Stochastic samples will randomize the samples. And so this is what we should be aiming for with our vector blur, something that looks about like that. So let's go back to our vector blur. We'll turn this back down. And we'll make sure that our vector blur looks something like that. And that seems to be, putting in about 2 seems to be what's giving us that kind of blur. So let's run out a quick test of this, and we'll move on. And there we go. It's got motion blur, and the seams don't seem so obvious. On a quick note, if you notice that you're getting little artifacts along the edges of frame here due to the vector blur, because remember, vector blur is just a 2D blur, it can artifact because there's nothing outside of the frame and it's trying to do a blur right along the edge of the frame here. The way to fix that is to enable overscan in your scanline render. So watch the edge here as I turn on overscan. You'll see it healed that little nibbly artifact along the edge where it was not able to find pixels to blur in. And you just have to increase this enough so that there's enough of an overscan to pull in some pixels. In this case, for this one, I don't know, 8 was probably enough. So if you ever notice that, and especially when the motion blur is very strong, you'll probably have to turn on some overscan. It will increase your render times, but it's much better compromise than having nasty artifacts along the edge of your frame when you're using vector blur.